Leviticus 25 was to be every 50 years. And we read in verse 8 of Leviticus chapter 25, "And thou shalt number 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years. And the space of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto thee 49 years. Then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month, in the day of atonement shall ye make the trumpet sound throughout all your land, and shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a jubilee unto you, and ye shall return every man unto his possession, and ye shall return every man unto his family." So the Jubilee year was a time of letting captives go free, and they would return, just as Israel had been set free from Egypt and was returning. But their return took 40 years because they sinned. The spies gave the evil report, and they searched the land of Canaan for 40 days, came back with an evil report, and as a result, God judged them and said, "You'll now have to wander in the wilderness a year for each day that you search the land." And of course, it wouldn't take 40 years to go from Egypt to the land of Canaan. They could have been there, I don't know exactly, since it was a big nation, but it's certainly within a couple of months. They could have traveled directly into the land of Canaan, but it was the Lord who said, no, you have transgressed. And then we actually read that their wilderness sojourn was in order for them to bear their iniquity. They would bear their iniquity, and God speaks of that 40-year period that he calls the day of temptation. Interestingly, 40 years called the day. That's how can God do something like that? Well, that's what we're saying now, isn't it? That Judgment Day, or the day of judgment, is a prolonged period of time stretching many years. And that would be biblical precedent. And in law, in courts of law, lawyers search old law cases in order to find precedent of a ruling so they can present it. And it's in our legal system, precedent has weight. It has weight and significance. And so when we find biblical precedent for something, it means it's permissible. It's allowable. Not necessarily always the case in the thing we're thinking or looking at, but certainly something to be considered as a legitimate possibility. That's what precedent establishes. And so when God calls the 40-day period of Israel's wilderness sojourn the day of temptation, that's something for us to consider. And he also speaks of it as a time of wrath. For example, in Hebrews chapter 3, and that would go along with the idea of Israel bearing its iniquities for 40 years. In Hebrews 3, it says in verse 8, "Harden not your hearts, as in the provocation, in the day of temptation in the wilderness, when your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my works 40 years. Wherefore I was grieved with that generation, and said, they do always err in their heart. They have not known my ways. So I swear in my wrath, they shall not enter into my rest." The 40-year period was an outpouring of God's wrath upon them for their sin, their murmurings, and the Lord knew the overwhelming number of them were not truly saved. It was only a handful. And so he actually punished them He punished them. But, I don't want to confuse anyone, because God sets up types and figures, and there's the great type and figure of all Israel coming out of Egypt, pointing to all the elect that are delivered from under bondage to sin and to Satan. That's one thing. But then there's a reality, a historical reality of the people that did come out, and again, the overwhelming number of them were not truly saved, and therefore their carcasses were left in the wilderness in God's wrath as they bore their iniquity. So that's the second thing to consider. First, the coming out of Egypt, point of great deliverance, wherein all Israel is delivered. Secondly, it's a period of wrath from the time they come out to the time they finally, eventually get to the promised land of Canaan. 40 years, the whole 40-year period. And so when we think of that, we can see a Jubilee year, which is the letting go of the captives, releasing the captives, relates to the great deliverance from Egypt. It also relates in the sense that after the 40-year period, in 1407 BC, that Israel did cross Jordan and enter into the land of Canaan, and it was 50 years later, 1357 was the first Jubilee, because it was marked from 1407. 1407 is the beginning date for Jubilees. And the first one was held exactly 50 years later, 1357. Then every 50 years, 1307, 1007, when David became king, was a Jubilee. And 7 BC, when Jesus was born, was a Jubilee, and so forth. And then when it projects into the New Testament, it's every year that ends 4494. 4494 in the first century AD, 144, 194, 1944, 1994, Jubilee year. Jubilee year. 1994 happened to be the 2000th year since Christ's birth, because Jesus was born in 7 BC, and 7 plus 1994 is 2001, and you always have to minus 1 when going from an Old Testament date to a New Testament date. So it's exactly 2,000 years, just like 33 AD to 2033 AD is exactly 2,000 years, but you don't have to minus a year. They're both on the New Testament side. And so Jesus's beginning of his first coming, Jubilee year, 7 BC, and then he went to the cross in 33 AD. And we have two dates, 1994 Jubilee year, that is exactly 2,000 years from his first coming, and 2033 that is exactly 2,000 years from the conclusion of his first coming. And the interesting thing about 2,000 years is that it is 40 times 50, or it's the 40th Jubilee. The year 1994 is the 40th Jubilee since Christ was born. And then we're looking at, sort of the adding on to that from 94 to 2033 of 40 inclusive years. So 40 Jubilees followed by 40 inclusive years, and then we would come to, perhaps, according to biblical evidence, will be the end of the world. But anyway, the similarity in 1994 being a Jubilee year, and the starting point, it's as Jubilee is identified with great deliverance, followed by 40 years of wrath. Because, when did Judgment Day start? When did Judgment Day begin? On one hand, it was May 21, 2011, but we're told, 1 Peter 4:17, that judgment begins at the house of God. So God's official beginning of the day of the Lord, or of his judgment, traces back to 1994. That was the official judgment on the churches and congregations. And so the Jubilee and judgment for 40 years, it fits in with what we're learning concerning Israel's coming out of Egypt. It's a historical parable. And over the course of those 40 years, how did they live? How were they nourished? How did they have their needs taken care of? It was through miraculous bread from heaven, manna from heaven, water coming out of the rock. The Lord provided for them. And this fits in with the whole idea of God opening up his word at the time of the end and revealing the scriptures, things never before known, just like no one had ever eaten manna from heaven prior to that 40 years, and no one ate manna from heaven after that 40-year period. It's all delivered by God just for that particular time, just as he gave us his word for this time of the end.